Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, uh, who is Don Bell. At our last meeting in January, we began to make plans for the coming year, and we identified areas where we wanted to focus our attention and efforts, such as broadly advocacy, which included supporting of getting computer equipment, training, and internet access to seniors, supporting of police reform, supporting strengthening of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, as well as other social impact topics. We also were looking for participation activities, which we will be working on continuing through the year. Then came January 6th and the insurrection on the national Capitol. What America saw that day was raw hate. That hate was rooted in our history, or at least the history we have been taught. Why is that what we are taught? Why does it persist? Why can't we overcome racism and bigotry? These are the questions we have been asking ourselves since January 6th. Returning to our January 2nd planning meeting and the topics we identified to pursue, and then juxtapose the events of January 6th to them, it is obvious that to pursue our goals, we needed to understand one of the main causes of why we need to work on those topics in the first place. In other words, why isn't there already fairness and equity in policing, healthcare, social services? I, as many of you, believe that it is racism and bigotry plain, and now it's painfully obvious. But not only the deadly manifestations we witnessed January 6th, but also the underlying miseducation that we got those insurrectionists to the point of what we witnessed. If we are to work on the topics we've identified, we need to do it with an understanding of how we got to this point. With a better understanding of the past, we can better understand what we are today, and we can better work on making changes to benefit us all. With that as our immediate goal, I would like to introduce someone that some of you already know, Don Bell, a community activist and Black history scholar, and who will bring us today some of our history that isn't in the textbooks that you had as a child, but which is our shared history nonetheless. History which can give us a new perspective on the past so that we can use our gained knowledge to influence how we approach our efforts in 2021. Let me introduce Don Bell. Thank you for being here, Don.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Fran. Good afternoon, everybody. And let me start this off by saying that, first of all, I really salute the Northside AARP organization for dedicating a series of programs to the issue of racial reckoning, which is one of the significant social issues in our country and around the world at this time. And when I was invited to do this, actually, it had been my political stance that I, as an African-American, would not spend a lot of time participating in these discussions, particularly with Americans who identified as white. From my political stance, this is an issue that we live with and we discuss quite a bit, and that white people have to address for themselves. But I'm breaking my my practice at this point because of a very kind invitation from a group of people who were very instrumental in making me feel welcome in this community. And out of my respect and affection for them, I'm going to venture outside of my little cubicle and comment on the issues of racial reckoning. Now, on January the 6th, I started out the morning pretty much the way many of you did, celebrating what I was calling at that time Stacey Abrams Day, as she had successfully supported an effort in Georgia that gave us two Democratic senators, one Black and one Jewish. which underscored an historical ethnic alliance between Jews and African Americans. And then the cherry on top of the sundae was that was also the day that Merrick Garland's nomination for Attorney General was also announced. So I was really good between 8 a.m. and 12 p.m. on Tuesday, January the 6th.
Me too.
Wednesday rather. But then the afternoon happened, and I was actually watching the proceedings as both houses were gathered in in the House chambers to confirm the election, the results from the Electoral College. And I was just watching, and they cut away, and they noted a group of people marching from the White House toward the Capitol, and continued to comment on what was going on in the House chamber. And every once in a while they cut away, and we'd see the group got closer and closer and closer. I wasn't really paying any attention to that. And but then I noticed that the group got closer than I would have assumed was permitted based on demonstrations that I had participated in Washington. And we got to that limit, and they kept going, and they kept going, and they kept going. And so I'm thinking to myself, boy, oh boy, if that'd been us, there'd be some dead bodies right now. And they kept going, and they kept going. And then I didn't really focus on it until they reported that the Capitol was breached. And what I saw from my African-American perspective was this. This was an assault not only on our government, but on the contributions of African-Americans, which are always questioned in terms of our status as Americans. But this was a building that was built by slaves, that was placed in its location by a landscaper named Benjamin Banneker, who was African-American, who did the work on the government district in Washington, D.C., while all of the credit went to Pierre L'Enfant, the French landscape architect. And that, to me, was part of our problem, that our contributions to American history are not well known and not recognized. And I thought about that, and I thought that, you know, if I were white, what would really concern me is the fact, not that I don't know African-American history, but I don't know American history, because it's so heavily edited in terms of race and ethnicity, because these things belong to all of us. So this is how we got to where we are in terms of racial reckoning. And what I thought about at the time was going back all the way in history. Anthropologically, we know that Homo sapiens, the humanoid forms in which we exist right now, came from Africa. We know that anthropologists say that we are all descendants of a common Eve from Africa 250,000 years ago. And just this last week, there was some anthropological discoveries in Gabon, right off of the west coast of Africa, that shows human artifacts that they guesstimate date back nearly 835,000 years. So that's a time or two. But the thing is, we know, if we think about it, and it can scientifically be proven, that while we assume that we are different, we are in fact all the same. Human beings do not vary, or vary less than 1/10 of a percentage point in terms of DNA, one from the other. And the things that we think make us different, skin color, eye shape, hair texture, do not in fact make us different beings. We are one being. So how do we get from that scientific truth to our sociological status? Well, in thinking about it, it occurs to me that whiteness is not a biological trait. It is in fact a socio-political trait. It is a measure of one's status in society. And we have many ethnic groups in the United States who, at the time of their coming into the United States and for long times afterwards, were not considered white, although biologically their skin is white. Certainly Americans of Irish descent, Americans of Italian descent, Jewish Americans can all easily think back to the times when they were not considered white. So again, how did we get to this point? Well, we got to this point because, in my humble opinion, we don't know enough about our history and we don't know enough about our civics. And so I invite those of you who come from a different cultural heritage than mine to suspend your disbelief a little bit about what you were taught and to perhaps embrace some alternative narratives on what the history of this region of the world, this continent, this country really were. Many people would be surprised to know that the first permanent resident of the oldest city in the United States, that the first patriot to die in the Revolutionary War, that the first permanent resident of the fastest growing city in human history, going from 0 to 3 million in less than a century, our own hometown, Chicago, were all people of African descent. And so our story is told more than in the 1619 project, because that was a little late, because St. Augustine, the oldest city in the country, was established in 1565. And in addition to that, we have to question other narratives that we've been told. One of the most popular, of course, is that the United States was settled from east to west, when in fact, what is now called the United States was settled from south to north, and also from west to east. And if we do that, we begin to cross these lines of racial division that we recognize in the United States. And again, we question how we've maintained these issues that lead to our need for racial reckoning at this point. Of course, we go back to Mother Africa again in the era of the Middle Passage, which is the era in which the bulk of slaves were brought from Africa to what is now the United States and to the Western Hemisphere. And we look at the numbers, which were huge. Over 10 million Africans were kidnapped to be enslaved in the United States. And in addition to that, the trade was so wealthy, so lucrative, and regard for human life was so little that nearly as many people were lost in the transport as actually successfully lived to reach the United States. The Gate of No Return in Western Africa, where most of the slaves were shipped from, records that there were nearly 2 million people who died committing suicide or being shot on the way to being shipped to the United States because they knew they would not be coming home again. And yes, there was a slave trade that existed before slavery in the United States, but in most of those cases, it was not the cruel and unusual punishment that it became in the US. Even here in the United States, before there was lifelong servitude, most people who were the victims of slavery were people who were involved in indentured slavery. And in fact, for the pre-lifetime servitude period, that was made up of two groups. It was made up of people from Africa and made up of Irish immigrants. And they were indentured basically to pay for passage to the United States, where they worked in servitude for a certain amount of time, and then they were freed. So there were plenty of people of African descent all through the years, including from 1619 on, when the first slave ships arrived, who were here as freedmen, or who were born into freedom rather than into lifetime servitude. But the evolution of lifetime servitude is what has really brought us to where we were. And it's easy to see what happened. We're told that slavery and racism are issues that are primarily born of the Southern United States. And that's not true. Slavery in America is born of the entire United States. And while the South was our agrarian center, the North was our industrial and our financial center. And the institutions of both rested on slavery. In American history, there are two groups who are part of my own personal ancestry: indigenous peoples and African people, who gave what became the economic basis of the United States. The indigenous people gave the land, and the African people gave the labor, which was free of cost for over 250 years, and continues in some point even today. There are areas of agrarian United States where people live barely above the minimum conditions of slavery. And it really is something of which we should really be ashamed, but it continues even till today. But the point is that even in our institutions of the North, say one of our great historical institutions, the First National Bank of Chicago, which is now half of what is known as JP Morgan Chase, the financing that that institution did was based on the slave market in the South. And that's true of institutions in New York City and all across the North. So slavery and racial exploitation do not belong just to the South. Now, without going on forever, I think that there's some important issues that one might visit oneself with before continuing with the discussion of racial reckoning and racial disparities. And one of our best tools for learning the truth is our own Census Bureau, which does a fantastic job of monitoring the life and experience of American citizens historically and in the present. And the Census Bureau regularly produces a report called The Status and Conditions of African Americans. And from that comes disturbing statistics about today. The average income of African Americans or the average income of white Americans is 1.5 times that of African Americans. And in average family wealth, the wealth of the average American white family is 5 times that of the average Black American family. How do we get to these inequities, and how do we deal with them? How do we solve them? Let's take a step back and look not only at racial history as we've seen it, those of us who were born post-World War II, but also let's look back on ethnic history in which this was also based. And we have varying experiences amongst different ethnic groups, along with racial inequities that we have to deal with historically. And what we've got to do is to be willing, again, to look at what we've traditionally been taught or not taught from new eyes. We have to be willing to separate ourselves from narratives that we have been taught all of our lives, and to look at these things anew from different perspectives. And when we do, then we can engage in conversation with one another, We can engage in a more truthful understanding of how we got this way, and we can develop a point of commonality from which we can go on together. I personally, and as I said before, I'm not here as the voice of Afro-Americana. I'm here as an African-American voice, not the African-American voice. And it is my firm belief that we are related to each other. And what we do is a measure of the humanity of all of us. I'm moved by the words, not only of Amanda Gorman, Youth Port Laureate at President Biden's inauguration, but also by the words of Maya Angelou at the second inauguration of William Jefferson Clinton, where she ended with the lines, "We are more alike than unalike. We are more alike than unalike. We are more alike than unalike." You can join me in that belief. If you can join me in the goals that we set out in the preamble of our Constitution about providing for the general welfare, if you can join me in beliefs not only of equality, but of equity, then we can have conversations and we can take actions that can get us from where we are now to where we need to be if we are going to succeed and persist as a human society. So that's it for me. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks for the opportunity. And I look forward to the continuing conversations on racial reckoning in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you,